There are places in the world where silence is not peace, where the mountains do not comfort but rather conceal, where the fog that rolls down into the hollows each November morning seems less like weather and more like a warning, a curtain drawn over things that should not be seen, a soft gray veil that the ridgelines wear like something they are hiding from the light. December 1, 1999. Lewis County, West Virginia, deep in the folded ridges of the Appalachian Highlands, where two-lane roads curve so sharply that headlights disappear without warning, and where neighbors are close enough to borrow sugar but far enough apart to keep secrets that never fully surface, two women vanished. Not quietly, not without leaving traces, not without leaving behind the kind of small, accusing details that whisper to anyone patient enough to listen, but in the way that terrible things sometimes happen in ordinary places, in the gap between one ordinary hour and the next, in the space between supper and sleep, in the brief and catastrophic interval when the people who are supposed to be safe are not. Their names were Maxine Stalnaker, 69 years old, a grandmother with worn hands and a small aluminum-sided house in Jan Lew that she had kept for decades with the stubborn care of a woman who understood that a home is a kind of testimony. And Mary Friend, 45 years old, Maxine's daughter, a woman who had survived hard years and hardened circumstances and still managed to smile at people when they passed her on the road. By the morning of December 2nd, both women were gone. Their home sat quiet in the way a house sits quiet when it has been emptied rather than merely vacated. The wood-burning stove inside had gone cold. A half-eaten meal sat on the kitchen table. The porch light had not been turned on. And somewhere between the last moment anyone saw them alive and the first moment someone noticed their absence stretched a silence that would not be explained, could not be explained, despite the best efforts of every investigator who came near it, for nearly 14 years. Who took them? Who walked into that small house in Jan Lew on a December evening and left it diminished? And more devastatingly, more precisely, more painfully, who among the people they had loved and trusted knew the answer all along and carried it quietly through 14 ordinary years? Lewis County sits in the north-central region of West Virginia, carved and shaped by the West Fork River, and surrounded by hills that ridge into one another like the spines of sleeping animals. Weston, the county seat, is the kind of place where the hardware store has been on the same corner for 40 years, where the owners of the diner know your order before you sit down, where a stranger's car parked too long in front of someone's house will be noticed and discussed before nightfall, and where that discussion will carry the weight of genuine concern rather than mere curiosity. Because in Lewis County, noticing things about your neighbors is not nosiness but a kind of community vigilance. A mutual insurance policy against the things that can happen to people who are, out here, somewhat alone. The county had seen better economic days. By 1999, the coal economy that had once given these mountains a kind of rough prosperity had contracted steadily for decades. The jobs that had sustained generations of Lewis County families had thinned. Young people had begun to leave, not reluctantly, not without grief for what they were leaving, but with the practical urgency of people who could read the economic mathematics and understood that the equation did not balance in their favor. The remaining residents, many of them elderly, some working-class families stretched thin, formed a community bound less by financial security than by proximity and shared history. People here knew each other the way people know each other when there is no escape from knowing, completely, faithfully, and sometimes dangerously. Maxine Stalnaker had lived in Jan Lew, a small rural community just outside Weston, for most of her adult life. At 69, she was the kind of woman that small communities anchor themselves around without ever fully acknowledging what they are doing, a grandmother figure, steady and deliberate in the way of people who have outlasted many of the things that once worried them. She had a small yard with a garden plot she tended in warmer months, a woodpile she kept stocked against the cold she knew was always coming, and a front door she rarely locked, because in Jan Lew in 1999, people did not lock their doors. Not then. Not yet. Not until something happened that rewrote the collective understanding of who their neighbors actually were. Maxine had grandchildren. She had a radio she kept playing through the morning hours. She had decades of life written into her kitchen, her pantry shelves, her worn armchair placed at an angle to catch the light from the window. Those details matter, not because they are unusual, but because they are the precise texture of a life that was present, inhabited, ongoing. A life that had not been finished when it was interrupted. Her daughter, Mary Friend, was 45 and had returned to live nearby after years of difficulty that those who knew her described in general terms, with the protective vagueness that people use when they are preserving someone's dignity. She had come back to be close to her mother. She drove when Maxine needed something from Weston. She handled logistics, ran errands, kept things moving with a practical resourcefulness that comes not from education or opportunity, but from having simply learned, across a long and sometimes difficult life, to manage. Those who knew them described their relationship the way you describe a roof, and the wall it rests on, one holding up the other, both necessary to the structure. The morning of December 1st, 1999, began the way most December mornings begin in Lewis County. The sky above the ridge was low and gray, committed to nothing, threatening everything, the kind of sky that keeps its options open all day, and then delivers neither the snow you feared nor the clearing you hoped for. The temperature hovered in the high 20s. Frost outlined every blade of yellowed grass in the yard with a thin white border, precise and cold, like a sketch of itself. The air carried the smell of wood smoke and cold clay, and something mineral from the creek that ran nearby. By all the accounts gathered later, it was an ordinary Wednesday. Maxine had been seen the day before, November 30th, at a local store in Weston, purchasing a few items, exchanging pleasantries in the unhurried way that rural communities sustain themselves through small daily rituals. She had seemed well. She had seemed herself. There was nothing in her posture or her expression or the quality of her conversation that Tuesday that would cause any person to look back later and say, "I should have known. I should have seen it." And that is part of the particular cruelty of what was coming, that it was invisible in its approach. It wore no warning. Mary Friend had also been seen on December 1st itself. She had stopped briefly at a neighbor's house sometime in the late afternoon, the timing placed by investigators at somewhere between 4:00 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. based on testimony gathered in the days following the disappearance. The visit was brief and unremarkable. There was no urgency in Mary's manner, no coded distress, no sense of a woman pausing at a doorway as though she were reluctant to return to where she was going. She was home before dark. No one who has studied this case has been able to establish, with certainty, exactly what happened inside that small house on the evening of December 1st. What investigators would later piece together from physical evidence and witness accounts suggested that sometime between 6:00 p.m. and 9:00 p.m., after the light had left the sky and the cold had tightened its grip on the hollow, something occurred within those walls that changed everything. The wood stove had not been stoked through the night, as Maxine invariably did during cold months. The meal on the table had been partially consumed but not cleared, plates and cups sitting in the arrested state of interrupted ordinariness, like a photograph of an evening that never reached its end. The door was unlocked but pulled shut. The porch light was off. Mary Friend's vehicle was not in the driveway where it was always parked. The swing in the yard hung still in the cold air. The toy truck belonging to a visiting grandchild, left weeks earlier beside the back step, lay on its side in the frozen mud. By December 2nd, a neighbor had noticed the absence of the usual morning indicators of life. No wood smoke from the chimney in the cold air. No lights in the windows at the hour when Maxine was always already moving through her morning. No faint sound of the radio she kept as a companion to her early hours. In Lewis County, that kind of absence is noticed. That kind of silence from a house that should be awake is felt like a temperature change. And so, with the careful hesitation of someone who does not want to cause unnecessary alarm, the neighbor made inquiries. By December 5th, when Mary Friend's vehicle was found abandoned in a parking area in Clarksburg, nearly 30 miles from Jan Lew, those quiet inquiries had sharpened into something with edges. The West Virginia State Police were called. The Lewis County Sheriff's Department opened a formal investigation. Both women were entered into the missing persons system. The vehicle found in Clarksburg told its own careful, quiet story. It sat at the edge of a parking area with the specific quality of something that has been placed rather than arrived. There were no obvious signs of disturbance in the interior, no disordered contents, no personal items scattered as though taken in haste, nothing that announced the obvious chaos of force. Just an empty car, keys absent, parked in an unfamiliar city 30 miles from home. Investigators photographed it, processed it, dusted its surfaces, and logged the results. What the car could tell them was limited. What it implied was much larger and much darker and much more difficult to prove. The house in Jan Lew was processed as a scene of interest. Nothing overtly dramatic marked its interior, no shattered furniture, no obvious signs of the kind of struggle that announces itself loudly. But those who walked through it with trained eyes found the space profoundly unsettled. The half-finished meal, the cold stove, the presence of Maxine's purse still hanging in its usual place. The medication she took daily, still sitting on the kitchen counter, untouched. Two women had seemingly left without telling anyone, without taking anything essential, without leaving a note, without making a phone call, without any forward-looking preparation whatsoever. Those small, quiet details, ordinary enough on their own, devastating in their accumulation, would gnaw at investigators for years. The search for Maxine Stalnaker and Mary Friend began in the way that searches in rural Appalachian communities most often begin, not through any single organized command, but through the organic activation of people who knew the women and could not remain still in the face of their absence. Neighbors showed up. Men who had known Maxine for 30 years arrived in coveralls and work boots, carrying flashlights and the willingness to walk every field and creek bank within reasonable distance. Women who had sat beside Mary at community gatherings organized themselves into informal teams, covering ground and asking questions with the purposeful energy of people who have decided that something must be done. The Lewis County Sheriff's Department coordinated with the West Virginia State Police to formalize the search into overlapping operations. Uniformed troopers canvassed the neighborhoods surrounding Jan Lew, knocking on doors along the gravel roads, sitting at kitchen tables across from people who might have seen something, asking careful questions, and writing down the answers in the patient shorthand of investigators who have learned to record everything and evaluate later. Search teams with trained dogs covered terrain along the likely routes between the house and Clarksburg. Divers searched the nearby reaches of the West Fork River in the gray December cold. The media took notice. Local television stations in Clarksburg and Weston ran segments. The Weston Democrat printed photographs. Flyers appeared at the post office, at the gas stations along Route 19, at the entrance to the Walmart in Weston. The kind of photographs that people look at for a moment too long in the checkout line, that create a small, cold discomfort somewhere behind the sternum before they turn away and continue with their day. The community held its breath in the specific, collective way that communities hold their breath when the thing that has happened is too close to abstract as tragedy and too concrete to dismiss as rumor. Clears throat. But as December became January and January became February, the search yielded nothing. The landscape, the fields, the creek banks, the forested ridges that ring Lewis County from every direction, revealed no trace that answered the essential question of where the two women were. The abandoned vehicle in Clarksburg had been fully processed. Fingerprints lifted from its surfaces were submitted to the state laboratory. The results generated no immediate breakthrough. The evidence was carefully cataloged and stored. Investigators, working with the professional discipline that separates good detective work from fruitless motion, began to focus their attention on the geography of relationship, on the people who had been closest to Maxine and Mary, who had known the house in Jan Lew, who had known their routines, who had known, specifically, when they were likely to be alone and unlikely to be missed quickly. Those who knew the family confirmed what investigators had already established through their early interviews. Mary Friend had a son. His name was Joseph Metz, and in December 1999 he was 25 years old. He was local. He was known in the community in the layered, textured way that people in small places are known. Not famous, not particularly notable, but present in the fabric of community life in all the ways that a person is present when they have grown up in one place and have nowhere else in particular to be. He knew the house in Jan Lew. He knew Maxine's habits. He knew Mary's schedule and routines. He knew, with the intimate knowledge of a son and a grandson, exactly how the rhythms of that small household moved through any given day. When the women would be there, what the house would look like when it was undisturbed, and what would need to look different to suggest they had left of their own accord. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves, not accusations, not yet, not the formal language of criminal allegation, but the professional unease that comes from sitting across a table from a person and finding that the emotional content of their responses does not align with the situation they are being asked about. In the language of criminal investigation, this is sometimes called a behavioral anomaly. In the language of ordinary human observation, it is simpler and more uncomfortable. Something was wrong. When investigators conducted formal interviews with Joseph Metz in the weeks following the disappearance, what those present later described was a composure that did not fit the expected shape of grief. Not hostile, not overtly deflective, not the aggressive performance of someone who suspects they are being suspected, but measured in a way that, to experienced officers who had sat across from many people in many difficult circumstances, carried the specific quality of a rehearsed emotion rather than a real one, of a person reciting what grief should look like rather than experiencing what grief actually feels like. He answered their questions. He cooperated with the investigation's basic requirements. He said what a concerned son and grandson might reasonably be expected to say. But the silences between his words held their own weight. Investigators noted specific inconsistencies in the accounts they collected. Timeline discrepancies emerged between what Metz reported about his whereabouts on the evening of December 1st and what other witnesses independently described. The distances between the locations he named, when plotted on a map and evaluated against the time windows he offered, created margins that did not easily resolve. A vehicle's odometer, examined as part of the investigation's physical evidence review, showed accumulated mileage inconsistent with the routes he described having traveled. small things, each one individually explicable, together, an outline of something that would not lie flat. One investigator's notes from early 2000, as later referenced in documentation connected to the case, described the evidentiary picture as a puzzle with most of the pieces present but none of them locked into position. The direction was clear. The road to a courtroom was not. Without the remains of the women, without a confirmed crime scene, without forensic confirmation of cause and manner, the investigation occupied a terrible middle ground. There were witnesses, timelines, behavioral observations, and a misplaced vehicle. But there was no definitive physical anchor, the most essential piece of evidence, the one that would transform everything else from circumstantial into conclusive, remained unfound. By the end of 2000, the investigation had slowed to its long, suspended state. The search operations had concluded. The media attention had moved to newer events. The flyers at the post office had been covered by newer flyers, and then by the ordinary accumulation of notices and announcements that plaster any small-town community board until nothing beneath them is legible anymore. The files at the Lewis County Sheriff's Department continued to thicken with reports and memos and interview transcripts, each one representing hours of careful work. But the case had no resolution, and without resolution it could not move forward. It could only remain. The swing in that yard still hung still, and no one came to sit in it. For those who have ever doubted someone they love, who have sat across a table from a face they know completely, and felt the awful, disorienting vertigo of suspecting that something essential about that person has been withheld from them. What follows in the years after the disappearance of Maxine Stalnaker and Mary Friend will feel uncomfortably, recognizably familiar. Time passed in Lewis County, the way time passes in places where something unresolved sits at the community's center like a stone beneath still water, invisible from a distance, felt by everyone who moves through the space above it. People moved on, as people must. Children who had been young in December 1999 grew into adults who remembered only the edges of it, the lowered voices at dinner tables, the conversations that stopped when they entered the room, the photographs of two women that appeared periodically in the newspaper, accompanied by the specific language of cases that have no answers. They carried second-hand knowledge of the disappearance the way people carry handed-down stories, with the shape of the thing but not its full weight. The house in Jan Lew did what houses do when their inhabitants are gone. It changed hands, or sat unoccupied through seasons that wore at its edges, or was rented to people who knew nothing of what had happened inside it, who ate their meals at the same kitchen table and looked out the same windows without any understanding of the accumulated history those walls contained. The specific human geography of loss worked itself out in ways invisible to any single observer, but collectively, quietly legible to the community that surrounded it. Joseph Metz, in the years following December 1999, continued to navigate his life in Lewis County for a period before eventually creating geographic distance between himself and the community, where his mother and grandmother had vanished. People who knew him in those years noted, with the retrospective precision that comes only after knowing what eventually becomes known, moments of deflection when the subject of Maxine or Mary arose. A particular stillness when someone brought up the case in conversation. A reluctance to sustain the topic, to let it breathe, to engage with it in the open, sustained, searching way that loss usually demands from those who carry it. But memory is treacherous when deployed backward through the distorting lens of what we come to learn. Without confirmed knowledge, the community could build nothing actionable from suspicion alone. Daily life asserts its demands with a persistence that even the most haunted places cannot fully resist. Bills arrive. Seasons change. The county moves through its hours regardless of what remains unresolved at its center. Clears throat. For those who have ever noticed that someone close to them carries a weight they will not name, who have recognized the behavioral signature of a person living simultaneously in two registers, the public one and the private one, the performed one and the true one. The years between 1999 and 2013 in Lewis County were a kind of slow, exhausting patience that sustained itself on nothing more than memory, and the stubborn human refusal to let the absence of two women become a permanent and unanswered feature of the landscape. In households across the county, conversations about Maxine and Mary persisted in the informal, kitchen table mode of communities that have no official outlet for their unresolved knowledge. Someone would bring up a memory. Someone else would nod. A third person would say they still thought about it, still wondered how it had been allowed to remain unanswered for so long. The wondering never stopped. It simply went underground, like a current beneath winter ice, present, moving, waiting for the specific conditions that would allow it to rise. The psychological weight of unresolved loss is a specific and documented burden. Those who studied grief in the late 20th century described it with clinical precision. The phenomenon of ambiguous loss, in which the absence of confirmed physical evidence prevents the grief process from reaching any of its conventional landmarks. There is no body to bury, no funeral to attend, no moment at which the community can formally gather around the fact of the loss and begin together the long work of processing it. Instead, there is only the open space where certainty should be, a space that never fills, that continues to demand emotional attention and offers nothing back. Within what remained of the Stalnaker friend family's social orbit, the psychological weight manifested in ways that were simultaneously ordinary and devastating. Relationships shifted along the fault lines of what people believed or suspected but could not prove. Trust, that foundational architecture of community life, developed cracks. The specific texture of grief in the absence of confirmed loss is a thing that clinical professionals describe in technical language, but which those who live it describe simply as, you can't let go because you never fully know what you're letting go of. There were no remains to bury, no headstone to visit, no confirmed ending to the story of either woman's life, only the terrible open space where an ending should have been, and the quiet, persistent, 14-year knowledge that someone knew how to fill that space and had chosen, morning after morning, year after year, not to. The West Virginia State Police Cold Case Unit, established in part to address precisely these kinds of dormant investigations, maintained the Stalnaker friend case in its active roster. The unit's philosophy was built on a faith in the cumulative capacity of time and forensic progress. The conviction that evidence which could tell no complete story in 1999 might, with the tools of 2010 or 2013, tell everything. DNA profiling had become both more precise and more widely applicable. Genetic genealogy was emerging as a transformative investigative resource. Digital records, cell tower data, electronic financial records, the accumulated footprints of modern life, existed now in ways that made the movements of any person on any given night far more reconstructible than they had been in 1999. Time, which had seemed like an obstacle to justice, was slowly being converted into a tool for it. Then, in early 2013, Lewis County Sheriff Adam Gissy directed his department's full attention toward the Stalnaker friend disappearances. Sheriff Gissy was a man who had come to office understanding that Lewis County's unresolved cases were not merely administrative inheritances but human obligations, specific, named obligations, with faces attached and families still waiting in that particular suspended state of not quite knowing. He assigned his detectives to the case with the instruction to treat it not as a historical artifact, but as a live investigation, to approach every piece of existing evidence as though examining it for the first time. Because, with the tools of 2013, much of it effectively was being seen for the first time. What followed was 4.5 months of comprehensive re-examination, re-interviews with every person who had spoken to law enforcement in 1999 and 2000, new interviews with people who had never been formally contacted, a systematic reassessment of physical evidence through forensic processes unavailable 14 years earlier, a patient, methodical reconstruction of the evening of December 1, 1999, built from the accumulated detail of everything the intervening years had made accessible. What they found was enough. There was no single dramatic moment of collapse, no cinematic confrontation in an interrogation room where the truth finally broke loose under the pressure of a clever question, no phone call in the middle of the night from a remorseful witness who had spent 14 years unable to sleep. The truth emerged the way long frozen ground reveals what it has held through the winter, through patient, accumulated pressure, through the steady application of tools that had not been available when the ground first hardened. Through the summer of 2013, the joint investigation involving Lewis County Sheriff's Department detectives and West Virginia State Police personnel worked with a methodical urgency that those inside it later described as carrying a specific weight distinct from ordinary casework. There was an awareness in it, the awareness that two women had been waiting for 14 years, that an answer existed and had been deliberately withheld, that the work being done in these months was not merely procedural but restorative, a kind of accounting that was owed and long overdue. Forensic evidence was re-examined through techniques unavailable in 1999. Physical traces that had been cataloged and stored across 14 years were run through updated analytical processes that produced results the original investigation could not have anticipated. Witness accounts that had seemed inconsistent or incomplete were mapped against the now available digital and physical records that could either confirm or contradict what witnesses had described, providing a layer of objective verification that transformed the testimonial landscape of the case entirely. The picture that assembled itself through those 4.5 months was both complete and terrible, complete in the specific legal sense that prosecutors require, an evidentiary foundation capable of standing before a jury and surviving reasonable scrutiny. Terrible in the human sense that family-involved crimes are always terrible, because the harm did not arrive from outside the circle of trust. It came from within. It rewrote the meaning of every shared meal, every holiday gathering, every moment of ordinary familial confidence that had preceded the crime and continued, unknowingly, in the years after it. Clear's throat. On the evening of Thursday, September 19, 2013, the Lewis County Sheriff's Department executed arrests in connection with the deaths of Maxine Stalnaker and Mary Friend. 3 men were charged. Joseph Metz, 39 years old, the son of Mary Friend, the grandson of Maxine Stalnaker, was among them. He was arrested late Thursday night. The following morning, he appeared in Lewis County Magistrate Court, arraigned on 2 counts of first-degree homicide, 2 counts of abduction, and 2 counts of burglary. His bail was set at $250,000. He was transported to Central Regional Jail. 2 additional men, whose involvement investigators had traced through the patient reconstruction of testimony and physical evidence, were charged alongside him. The specific details of each individual's role in the events of December 1, 1999, would become the subject of formal legal proceedings. What was clear, from the moment the charges were filed, was that the investigation had done what cold case investigations are designed, above all else, to do. It had converted the direction of probability into the architecture of proof. Sheriff Jissy spoke to reporters on the afternoon of the arrests with the composed steadiness of a law enforcement officer who has completed an obligation rather than won a competition. "It's been a 4.5-month investigation on our part," he said, "on top of the 14 years before us. And we compiled all the information, re-interviewed every party involved and then some, and then we were blessed to have been able to effect the arrests that we did." His voice, in recordings of that press conference, carried the specific quality of a man who is choosing his words precisely, who knows that blessed is exactly right, that this outcome was not guaranteed, that it had required sustained commitment over a period that would have exhausted lesser investigators. Lewis County prosecuting attorney Michael Smith added his own formal assessment to the record that afternoon. He said, "The term cold case seems to simply mean new challenge for these fine investigators. I've been in this field for 4 decades. I've never seen a better investigation run. They are certainly to be commended." In those words, deliberate, formal, the words of a man who chooses each one, there was the compressed weight of 14 years of frustration finally given direction, shape, and the possibility of resolution. The news of the arrests reached Weston and Jan Lew and the broader Lewis County community in the way significant news reaches small communities. Not through any single channel, but through the simultaneous, overlapping transmission of phones ringing and car doors slamming, and people stopping each other at the gas station, and on the sidewalk, and in the parking lot of the grocery store to confirm what they thought they had just heard. What followed was not a simple, uncomplicated collective relief. It was something more layered, more honest, more difficult. In a community where everyone had known everyone involved, where the names on the charging documents were names that people had heard spoken at gatherings, that had been mentioned in condolence after the disappearance of the very women they were now alleged to have harmed. The revelation produced a specific kind of communal vertigo that no single emotion could accurately describe. Those who had suspected Joseph Metz since those early December days of 1999, who had noted the behavioral discrepancies and felt the cold logic of proximity pointing in one direction for 14 years, did not experience vindication so much as exhaustion. The exhaustion of having carried a suspicion through more than a decade, of having sometimes expressed it and been doubted, of having watched someone move through the shared world of Lewis County with what appeared to be ordinary normality while carrying the knowledge of what he had done. "I always knew," one longtime community member said quietly to a local reporter, in words that contained not triumph but a grief that was, if anything, larger than the grief that had preceded the answer. "I always hoped I was wrong." Those who had not suspected him, who had offered him condolences in the years after 1999, who had spoken the names of his mother and grandmother with the shared sadness of people who believed they were grieving together, experienced a disorientation that resists simple numbing. The person they had known, the relationship they had extended across 14 years of shared community life, receded. In its place appeared a figure they could not fully reconcile with the person they had believed him to be. This is one of the specific cruelties of cases where the person responsible is known and trusted rather than unknown and feared. The community does not simply lose 2 women to an act of violence. It loses its understanding of someone who was part of it. It loses confidence in its own perceptions. It loses, in a way that is subtle but real, a piece of its capacity to trust itself. The formal legal proceedings that followed moved through the Lewis County court system, with the careful deliberation that serious criminal cases require. The evidence assembled through 14 years of investigation and 4.5 months of intensive review was presented through proper legal channels. The physical evidence, including forensic findings from the remains of Maxine Stalnaker and Mary Friend, which investigators had located as part of the renewed investigation, formed the factual core of the prosecution's case, providing the definitive answers that 14 years had withheld. For those who had loved the two women, the family members who had endured the specific anguish of ambiguous loss, who had not known whether to mourn or to hope, who had attended no funeral and visited no grave because there was no grave to visit, the confirmation of the physical evidence brought something that was terrible and necessary in equal measure. The worst had been true. The worst had been confirmed. And now, at last, it could be fully faced. There is a particular mercy in finality, not a comfort. Nothing about this was comfortable, but a mercy nonetheless. The body can be recovered and given proper rest. The name can be spoken in the past tense without uncertainty trailing behind it. The grief, which for 14 years had no proper shape, could find its proper form. The loss could be mourned completely, rather than incompletely, rather than in the terrible suspended state of not quite knowing that had been the only option available. In a development that illustrated the complexity long-dormant cases invariably produce when they finally reach adjudication, a Lewis County Circuit Court judge subsequently addressed certain aspects of the charges, demonstrating the specific legal friction that decades-old cases encounter in courtrooms, the challenges of evidence preservation across long time periods, the complications of witness memory, the procedural questions raised by gaps in the evidentiary chain. The wheels of justice, once set in motion by the September 2013 arrests, moved through that friction as the legal system required. But the essential facts that the investigation had established did not change. They stood as bedrock beneath whatever procedural complexity the legal process required them to navigate. That on December 1, 1999, in a small house in Jan Lew, West Virginia, 2 women had been taken, and that those responsible had moved through the community for nearly 14 years before being held accountable. The Lewis County Courthouse, on the mornings after the arrests, drew community members who stood in the September cold outside its steps, speaking in the careful, lowered voices of people reckoning with something enormous. An elderly woman who had known Maxine Stalnaker for 40 years stood near the entrance with her arms folded against the chill, her face composed in the specific stillness of someone who has received news that they both expected and were not ready for. She did not speak to the reporters who approached her. She looked up at the ridge above the town, the ridge that had watched over Lewis County through every season, through every generation, indifferent to all of it. And after a long moment she looked back down at the courthouse steps and walked inside. What she carried through those doors, only she could say. But it looked, from the outside, like the weight of 14 years finally arriving at the place it had always been heading. What the case of Maxine Stalnaker and Mary Friend reveals, when examined from the distance that time and resolution provide, is not simply a crime and its eventual accounting. It reveals something about the nature of truth in small places, about how a community can hold a suspicion in its collective body for more than a decade without any formal means of acting on it, about how the architecture of ordinary daily life, the routines of neighbors, the rhythms of small institutions, the human habit of extending trust to the people we have always known, can conceal extraordinary wrongs for extraordinary lengths of time. It reveals something about investigators who refuse to stop, about a sheriff who inherited cold files and chose to see them not as burdens to be managed, but as moral obligations to be met. About witnesses who spent years carrying pieces of knowledge in silence before, finally, finding the words or the courage or the circumstances to speak them. About the forensic sciences, which advanced quietly and relentlessly across 14 years and made visible what earlier tools could not see. Clears throat. For those who have ever lived near an unanswered question, who have known the specific weight of not knowing, the exhaustion of sustained uncertainty, the strange half-grief of loss without confirmation, the resolution of the Stalnaker friend case offers something that is not quite comfort but is recognizably its cousin. The knowledge that answers can come, that the mechanisms of justice are slow but not in the end incapable, and that the truth, however long it takes to surface, does not dissolve. Lewis County, West Virginia, is still the place it has always been. The ridges rise around Weston in every direction, dressed in the colors of whatever season is passing through them. The West Fork River moves through the valley as it always has, indifferent to the years that accumulate along its banks. The fog rolls in through the hollows on cold December mornings, soft and gray and full of everything it covers, covering the ridges, covering the small houses along the gravel roads, covering the swing that hung still in a yard in Jan Lew on the morning of December 2nd, 1999, when the world of two ordinary women had already and irrevocably changed. But two women who once kept a wood stove burning and a radio playing through the morning hours, who tended gardens and locked no doors and sat in armchairs positioned to catch the light, were taken from that landscape before their time. And the community that surrounded their absence for 14 years, that never entirely let their names fall into silence, that held its knowledge in kitchens and churches and on gravel roads and at gas station pumps, did what communities at their very best are capable of doing. It remembered, it insisted, it endured, and when the instruments of justice finally caught up to what the community had long understood, Lewis County witnessed the reckoning with the solemn, sustained attention that Maxine Stalnaker and Mary Friend had deserved all along. There is a phrase that runs through every cold case that finally finds its resolution, spoken in the language of investigators, prosecutors, and community members who have lived with the long arc of it. Justice delayed is not justice denied. It is a belief, nearly an act of faith, in the capacity of human persistence, combined with time and the steady advance of the tools available to investigators, to eventually deliver what the immediate aftermath could not. Maxine Stalnaker, 69 years old, grandmother, woman of worn hands and an unlocked door and a radio she kept as mourning company. She deserved to grow old in the house she had tended for decades, to watch grandchildren come and go through the summers, to be remembered in the full measure of a long life fully lived. Mary Friend, 45 years old, daughter, a woman who came home to be near her mother, who kept things moving, who managed what needed managing. She deserved the ordinary continuation of an ordinary life, the chance to find out who she would become in the decades that were taken from her. Both women were taken too soon. Both were found, eventually, by investigators who refused to let their absence become a permanent and unanswered feature of the landscape. Both women's names were spoken in a courtroom, finally, in the formal language of accountability. They are remembered not by how they were taken, but by all the years they lived before that December evening, and by the stubborn, unwavering insistence of those who refused to let their story end without an answer. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard. Sources: Lewis County Sheriff's Department records, WV Metro News, September 19, 2013. West Virginia State Police Cold Case Unit, West Virginia Public Broadcasting Cold Case Archive, Crime Stoppers of West Virginia, WBOYcom Missing Persons in West Virginia.